of questions being asked today after the loss of Columbia and those 7 astronauts on Saturday. A lot of questions being asked about how safe the shuttle really is. We're joined by somebody right now who knows the Columbia shuttle inside and out. He is former NASA astronaut. Colonel Tom Hendricks flew 4 shuttle missions, including 2 on the Columbia. Colonel, we're very sorry for the loss to your astronaut family, and we thank you so much for joining us. Let me start out by asking you, as reported first here on MSNBC, there was an internal NASA memo saying that it looked like there had been a lot of damage to that left wing, to the tiles on the left wing of the aircraft from that piece of foam that flew off at launch. Based on what you know, do you think that NASA underestimated the damage done to the shuttle aircraft?
Well, I think it's too early to tell. Obviously, the engineers did analyze the film during the launch, and their analysis determined that there was no reason to suspect that the result would end up being catastrophic re-entry. However, this investigation that's ongoing may yet determine that that damage was the cause, but there are still other things that could have caused Saturday's tragedy.
Well, Colonel, I read earlier today that in earlier flights, the NASA turned to some satellite things, the National Reconnaissance Office, and asked them to take some satellite photographs of a shuttle to inspect and see if there were any damage to the tiles. They didn't do so in this case. Don't you think they should have?
Well, if the analysis of that film after launch indicated that it wasn't life-threatening, I could understand why they wouldn't take other national assets away from their primary roles to look at something that the film or the telescopes may not be able to help with anyway. And as Ron Dittemore mentioned, in his estimation, they had tried that before, found it not to be very usable, and therefore ruled that out as an option. And if you look at it from the larger perspective, it would not have changed the result.
Colonel Hendricks, when you say look at it from a larger perspective, it would not have changed results. We are hearing that if some of these tiles were torn away, and I guess our reporter indicated it could be as much, I suppose, as almost a square foot and a half. Is it possible that it was a doomed flight right after launch if they tore away a number of these tiles?
Pat, that is a possibility. There is just no contingency procedure for replacing or repairing tiles on orbit. We might hope that they could, but there really isn't any way to guess which of 20,000 individually shaped tiles might have to be replaced. We couldn't cut one on orbit, plus there's no safe way to get a spacewalker to that side of the vehicle. The other option that's been mentioned is going to the space station.
Right.
With Columbia's orbit, the way it was related to the space station, there's just not enough fuel on board to make that orbital transition.
Well, see, that's what I wanted to ask. If you knew, for example, the tiles had been ripped away so much that the life of the vehicle and the life of the crew was in jeopardy, could it get to the space station and at least offload 5, say, of the 7 astronauts so that the pilot and the co-pilot, if you will, could then try to bring the ship home at very high risk? But you are saying it is an impossibility, given the fuel on the shuttle, to get to the space station and offload several of the astronauts?
That's correct. There's almost 20 degrees of inclination difference between those 2 orbits. For the Columbia to make a rendezvous with the space station, they would have had to have launched in nearly the same inclination, which is close to 52 degrees, to get to the space station. There's just not enough fuel on board any of the orbiters to make much of an inclination change in an orbit.
Okay, Colonel Hendricks, stay with us if you will. I want to ask you whether or not you believe that the space shuttles, the last 3 ships that we have, should be grounded until we find out what happened. We'll be back with those questions right after these messages on MSNBC, America's News Channel.
MSNBC's Money Minute is brought to you by Sprint.
Every time I travel. In time where an individual, Greg Easterbrook, says, look, this is an old technology. They've got old computers. It was supposed to cost $5 million a flight. It's now $500 million. That the materials in those tiles have been replaced basically by more modern materials, yet they're using all this old technology. and we ought to wait for the space plane and ground these shuttles as too dangerous. What is your response to that?
Well, the computers, for one, have been updated. In fact, if you looked at the inside of Columbia prior to the mission, it would look much different than it did in 1981. The airframe still looked the same from the outside, but many things have been upgraded in the interior. Whether it was too expensive, that's debatable, but that's the machine that we have available now that can take humans to and from space. We've continued our expansion of space with the creation of the International Space Station, and that's the shuttle's mission currently.
Colonel, there was a group of NASA engineers that went in front of Congress last year, and the message to Congress was that Congress, have cut NASA's budget to the point where they're really taking some unnecessary risks with equipment, with personnel, and perhaps even with the safety of these aircraft. Do you share those concerns?
Well, I left the Astronaut Corps about 5 years ago. Of course, the debate is a continuing one around budget. It is a trade-off whether you can operate effectively and efficiently to do two human spaceflight initiatives, the International Space Station and the Space Shuttle. They're dependent upon each other. They do share some resources, and I think this expanding investigation will determine whether the cuts were too deep.
Do you think this accident could be the result of some budget cuts?
I would be surprised if that's the case. I know many of the engineers and technicians, every one of them was dedicated to their mission. They recognized how critical their individual efforts are to the success of every mission, and I think there would have been much more of an outcry if it was truly getting to a dangerous point.
Colonel Hendricks, thank you so much for joining us today. Colonel Tom Hendricks, former astronaut, flew 2 flights on the shuttle. When we come back, folks, we're going to have a very special report right here in Buchanan Press from the Kennedy Space Center about those heat-resistant tiles, how they work and don't work on the shuttle. Buchanan Press, MSNBC, America's news channel.
Honey!
This beautiful little girl is Vanessa.
Once from Israel. He was a very modest, very positive, very optimistic person. And he left us with the people he loved in the place that he really wants to be.
The grieving widow of Ilan Ramon, Israeli war hero and the first Israeli astronaut, lost Saturday aboard the shuttle Columbia. As we've been talking, folks, all the investigation so far, even just the conversation, seems to be focusing on those heat-resistant tiles that were lining Columbia's left